Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. We are Memoria Altera, and this is our trailer.
All right. I'm Ben Skiba.
I'm Aiden Padula.
I'm Keenan Jones.
I'm Ellis Gordish.
I'm Caleb Prouty.
And I'm Owen Nizak.
We would like to do a special thanks to our advisors and our ISPs. We literally could not have done this without you.
So starting off with just a brief synopsis of our game. One of the first things we really wanted was a dark and moody atmosphere, heavily influenced by our shader development, which we started quite early. You'll find out more about that later. We also really wanted to talk about disinformation and misinformation, especially how it spreads in a medical context. And so we ended up deciding on a narrative-driven escape room-style puzzle game where the main gameplay loop is the player, as you explore, you solve, and then you escape. A brief plot summary of our game is you wake up on the floor in a futuristic lab with no memories. And so you explore the lab with the help of your fellow amnesiac, Lenny, who you'll meet in just a few slides. And you solve puzzles to explore more of the lab and unlock your memories and find out who you really were.
All right. So during pre-production, we had to, of course, create the concept of our game. And we did a very democratic approach for this, which meant all of us compiled ideas, we voted upon it, eventually took bits and pieces of the concepts we liked and merged them into one bigger one. This actually kind of gave us a very good step into how our team dynamics worked later on, which will be in the next slide. Once we had our game concept, we wanted to figure out what mechanics would fit best with the story that we created. So we wanted puzzles to interact with that push the narrative along. We wanted to have exploration, so you had to find these puzzles rather than them just being presented to you. And we also wanted to use the present and a use of memories in order to convey different points of our game and our story beats. First, our game pillars. Our first game pillar being the narrative unwraps around the player through the use of puzzles and regained memories. Second, explore how systematic disinformation facilitates the spread of unintentional misinformation. Thirdly, the tone begins as foreboding and grows into uneasy as the player character learns more about their role in society.
Awesome. Now I'll talk a bit about our team philosophy, which is primarily built off of our unique circular management structure. In this management structure, every member of the team at one point took a leadership role, depending on what we were doing. If we were focusing on writing the paper, it would have been Ben. If we were focusing on puzzles, it would have been one of the members of the tech team, so on and so forth. This system created a very natural ebb and flow responsibility and workload that helped prevent burnout and ease transitions between different aspects of the project. This structure would not have been possible without the way we started making our game and having conversations and deciding collectively what we wanted to make. Having each member heavily invested in the concept allowed a baseline level of trust to believe in ourselves to take on this circular management structure. And then once the ball gets rolling, it works and keeps on building trust over time, reinforcing those positive connections.
So in order to get the whole team on the same page, we used Miro, which is kind of just like a storyboard service. And I compiled all of our story beats, narrative moments, like if it's in the present, in a memory sequence, and this kind of formed all the connections between our puzzles, the design documents, the dialogue, and this allowed the team, without needing to constantly come to me asking what happens when, to check our timeline, to check where our puzzles are, what assets need to be made, and really made our flow of production very fluid, allowing us to get through our levels very, very efficiently.
All right, now let's take a look at Memoria Altera by the numbers. So for this game, we created 103 unique props, 30 different character animations, 4 characters, and 2 shader systems. For the environmental storytelling, we wanted to emphasize show, don't tell. This was so that we could introduce the player to the concepts of misinformation that exist in the society without kind of directly bonking them on the head with it. So like in this image, you can see here, we have this kind of dark and contrasting colors between the shaders and the hatching system and the bright lights, as well as the like blood and kind of uncomfortable looking medical equipment that is in here to kind of make the player aware that something is wrong in this environment, but they can't quite figure out what. Leading into that is the clean and orderly lab that we created that contrasts with that very dark atmosphere. This was to kind of create some like sterile feeling lighting in the lab while also having these really dark shadows to kind of make the player feel uneasy. So in here you can see the very dark shadowing along with the contrasting bright lights in this hallway. And finally, we created long winding hallways that would consistently disorient and confuse the player. So for example, in this image here, you can see we have a round circular hub with 4 connecting areas. And this was to kind of keep the player in this state of disorientation where from above it might look very easy to navigate, but when you're stuck in this circle and all of the hallways look the same, you become very disoriented and confused as you play.
All right, so moving on to talk about the shader systems we made for the game. It was an early priority. The decision to use shaders came very early in development. We had these ideas for the 2 separate segments of the game, being the present and the memory sequences, and we wanted to see if we could use shaders to portray this visually. So for the hatching shader, we wanted something that was dark and stylized, but grounded in realism, kind of reminiscent of Telltale Games, the Walking Dead series. And then for the memory sequences, we wanted something very different that was washed out and fuzzy and kind of felt like a direct link to the concept of a memory. Unfortunately, we ran into our first big issue where nobody on the team knew anything about shaders. Yeah. Thankfully, due to how early the team got together and started brainstorming, we had plenty of time to build foundational knowledge on the systems. Overall, the shader system design was a consistent and very rewarding learning process that we iterated upon throughout the year. Moving on to talk about the characters, there are 4 main characters in the game. The player character, Dr. Polliman, Lenny, Rebecca, and Dr. Ilo, all which fit key roles within the narrative. From an artistic perspective, they were also designed to fit that art style, being semi-stylized but also grounded in realism. And while we didn't have a ton of characters going into the game, we knew we wanted to establish a clear character pipeline early on. So we referenced previous MQP's pipelines work and kind of compared that to our team's existing skill set to make something that worked for us. So for each character, we started with some very rough concept art. Then we moved to some blockouts to translate them over to 3D. After some iterations, we finished the high poly models. Characters were then retopologized and rigged. And then finally, each character was animated, textured, and implemented in-game, kind of finishing the cycle of concept to real life.
Next, we have the interactables that the player would actually use during the game. The 2 main ones that we wanted were items and puzzles. And to do that, we created an interactable interface that was implemented in both items and puzzles. Items, all you needed to keep track of was if a player clicked on it, and for puzzles, we needed to keep track of if the player clicked, if they held down, when the player let go. So the basic pipeline of it was items just implement the interface, while puzzles have a puzzle base class that keeps track if it's completed or not, and as well as implementing each function in the interface that allowed us to keep track of that and building every puzzle off of that.
Moving on to puzzle design, when we created all these puzzles, we wanted to kind of classify them with 3 major criteria. The first is difficulty. Difficulty is just how hard the puzzle is. It's more subjective, but for us, we managed to get a more average reading. Next is complexity, which is how much the player has to consider when doing the puzzle, or the cognitive load placed upon the player just to even complete it. And lastly is depth, just how many steps the puzzle takes to complete. For some small examples, something with high difficulty but low complexity would be something like a sliding tile puzzle. Yeah, it's not, figuring out how to solve it isn't as difficult, but actually doing it is the difficult part. And for an example for depth, in our game we have a maintenance box puzzle where first the player needs to find a screwdriver and then open a box and then complete a puzzle inside. So that has more depth than just a single puzzle that they have to complete, or a single step for that one puzzle. So we also created a cutscene system. So Unreal Engine has its own cinematic camera system built in, but we found that it lacked a level of interactability that we were looking for player involvement in these cinematic moments. So we ended up creating our own cinematic camera system from the ground up. It's made of 3 core components. The first is a spline path. A spline is just a series of points connected by curves, and you can control the angles for them. So it makes it really easy in editor to control exactly how the camera path is going to move, how exactly the camera path is going to look, and without having to do a lot of extra coding. The next part is the main loop, which you'll see on the next slide, and lastly, a node system. So here's the main loop. It's actually quite simple. Oh my, that's not at all. Oh, that is so much better. Okay. So it seems bad, but it's actually quite simple. So it runs the beginning task, and then in a loop, it increments the distance traveled and the time passed, and then it checks if it's done. If it isn't, it checks if it's past any nodes along the path, and if it has, it runs them. It's actually quite simple when you take out all the complicated parts. But finally, for the node system, we created 5 different kinds of nodes for controlling various aspects of the camera and the game world. And we also created in-engine tools for showing them along the path, because really they're all just a bunch of variables, so it's kind of hard to visualize them. So what we did is we placed them along the path, as you can see in the diagram on the right.
Yeah. All right. Now that we've talked about our team, the game we made, and how we made it, we'll share some of the things we learned and lessons we have. First off is that having a strong focus on collaboration, understanding each other's work styles, and setting up good communication systems early on will pay off in dividends. Our team spent a lot of time on this during pre-production, and it ensured that we were able to overcome a lot of the obstacles we faced. Next is that you can't foresee disruptions. Our teammate Owen getting re-diagnosed with cancer forced us to adapt in ways we didn't think we'd have to. Being able to know when to cut things and accepting that you have to change your initial plans is an imperative skill to have if you want to see a project all the way to the finish line. Next is that integrating new tech can be very risky. 2 examples is with our cutscene system. It was well worth it. It took a lot of time, but allowed us to do things we otherwise would not have been able to do. On the other hand, we considered using mocap for animations, but we concluded that the time to ramp up to use it would not have been worth it, as we could find alternatives. All that to say is that with your teams, take time to think of the pros, cons, and alternatives when integrating new tech. Lastly, is that an MQP is not, in fact, a game jam. In our excitement and rush to create a game, we overlooked some other aspects of pre-production. We just spent a lot of our first semester learning when to research and plan versus when it was time to create. This project has been exciting, tiring, enlightening, and most of all fun. Thank you again for coming.